Anyway, this year, 2020, is not only the 250th anniversary of the voyage of the Endeavour up the east coast of Australia, it's also the 200th anniversary of the death of Sir Joseph Banks. He died on the 18th of June, 1820, aged 77. At the time of his death, he'd been president of the Royal Society for 42 years and was one of the most outstanding figures in English public life. Throughout his long career, there was one constant in the life of Sir Joseph Banks: his love of books. At first sight, Banks was an unlikely person to become a bibliophile. Born to a family which owned extensive property in Lincolnshire, of which he would become the sole heir, the pattern of his life when he was born in 1843 would on the face of it appear to be a country gentleman involved primarily in the management of his estates. If he acquired any interest outside his estates, it would have been involvement in county affairs, possibly as a magistrate and eventually as a member of parliament. The only emphasis his family placed on education was to instill the basic skills of literacy and numeracy to equip him to take his place as a gentleman in the society to which he would inherit. At the age of 9, he was sent to Harrow, and 4 years later, in September 1756, he was sent to Eton. At Eton, Banks experienced difficulties with the predominantly classical syllabus based on the study of Latin and Greek. But it was while at Eton that the young Banks became fascinated with plants growing along the banks of the Thames and in the laneways near the school. During a break between terms, he found a copy of Gerard's Herbal belonging to his mother, which he used as a reference book for identifying plants during his wanderings at Eton and Revesby Abbey during his holidays. This was the first book which Banks acquired, and it remained in his possession for the rest of his life. In December 1762, Banks entered Christ Church College, Oxford. He took advantage of the academic freedom of Oxford at the time, although some might view it as a dereliction in duty on the part of the professors and tutors. The professor of botany, Humphrey Sibthorpe, had not given a lecture in 30 years. Banks took the unusual step of hiring a tutor for himself, a man called Israel Lyons from Cambridge. Banks left Oxford after 3 years without taking a degree, which was not uncommon for somebody of his background, as the heir to large estates who did not need a university degree in order to earn a living, or into one of the learned professors. After leaving Oxford in August 1764, Banks purchased a house at New Burlington Street in London, and for this time that he began purchasing books on a large scale after coming into his inheritance. As a serious collector, Banks commissioned a book plate. Although based on his family crest, on his family coat of arms, it was also a statement of his interests with the elaborate surrounding foliage. In 1768, Banks persuaded the Admiralty to allow him to go on the Endeavour, together with Dr. Daniel Solander, several artists, including Sidney Parkinson, and 4 servants. He took 40 books on the Endeavour, the most important of which was the second edition of Linnaeus's Species Plantarum. Banks' copy was interleaved, and on the blank pages, Solander named and described over 1,200 plants which Banks collected on the voyage. Before he left on the Endeavour, Banks also abandoned his book plate and instead marked his books with a rectangular stamp based on his signature. He employed this book stamp for the rest of his life. In addition to the large collection of artefacts and drawings, Banks also returned from the Endeavour voyage with thousands of specimens of plants, which added to the book collection. Daniel Solander became Banks's librarian and remained in this position until his death in 1782. In 1777, Banks acquired a larger, Banks married and started looking for a larger house. He purchased the lease of 32 Soho Square, which was to be his London residence for the rest of his life. One of the main attractions of 32 Soho Square was the addition of a separate building behind the main house, where Banks stored his herbarium and other specimens. Above this, he constructed a large library over 2 levels. After Solander's death, another Swede, Jonas Dryander, became Banks's librarian and curator of his collections, a position he held until his death in 1810. By the 1790s, Banks's book purchases had reached the stage where he had 15,000 books. We know this because Dryander prepared a catalogue of Banks's library, which was published in 5 volumes between 1796 and 1801. After Dryander's death, Banks appointed Robert Brown as librarian and superintendent of his collections. One measure of the extent to which Banks valued his books and other collections are the provisions contained in his will. On the 21st of January, 1820, Banks added a codicil to his will and made several far-reaching decisions as to the dispersal of his books and other collections. The first was to leave his collections to Robert Brown for his use and enjoyment during his lifetime. Banks added the condition that the aforesaid bequests in favour of Robert Brown are upon condition that he continue to use his library as his chief place of study, as he now does, and continues to reside in London and does not undertake any new charge that may employ his time. To this purpose, he left Banks £200 per annum. He then made the extraordinary provision of leaving his house at Soho Square, where the books and collections were located, to Robert Brown for the rest of his life. Banks did not own the freehold of Soho Square. It was part of the Portland estate, but in 1877 he had purchased the lease, which had a term of 78 years. And Robert Brown lived at Soho Square for the remainder of his life and died in 1855, the same year as the lease expired. Under the terms of the codicil of 21st of January 1820, Brown transferred the books and herbarium specimens to the British Museum on condition that they be housed in a separate department over which Brown was appointed librarian. They remained in the British Museum until the 1880s, when the Natural History Museum was constructed at Cromwell Road, and the specialised collections, such as the botany collection, were moved to the Botany Library at the Natural History Museum, where they remain to this day, together with all the Parkinson drawings that were made on the Endeavour voyage. It's clear from the detailed provisions of his will that Banks' main concern was to keep his book collection intact after his death. The plan conceived by Banks only months before his death to preserve the book collection intact long after his death is not so much an act of vanity aimed at perpetuating his memory, but an indication of the extent to which he valued his books above all his other possessions. Having spent a lifetime gathering the books and moulding them into a collection which reflected his deepest interests, it is fair to say that he did not only value his books above all else, but that he loved them. The intellectual energy and creative intelligence which he expended throughout his life on forming his library not only gave him great satisfaction, but was one of his greatest achievements from a personal point of view.
That's your 10 minutes, so 5 more minutes to go.
I've only got another couple of sentences. His books and all that they represented were probably closer to Banks's heart than most people who are not collectors could imagine. Love of books is not only the mark of a true bibliophile, but it also occupies a place in a person's life which surpasses all other interests and affections. Today, 200 years after his death, there are no public monuments to Banks, either in England or in Australia, although he's known as the father of Australia. But his book collection, the bulk of which is now in the British Library, and the specialised collections are in the Natural History Museum, are the only lasting memorial to him, which has endured over the 200 years. I'm sorry that you couldn't see the PowerPoint presentation that I'd prepared.
We were thinking you might, if you send it to us, we can put it online.
Yes, I'm trying to get it up, but I don't know. I don't know how to do this. Well, that's all I had to say. But unfortunately, you've missed out on seeing the images.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that presentation. And yeah, I think you can email it to the team. We'll put it somewhere where people can even download it in the next few minutes. So
yes, I had it up before, but it's somehow or other it's dropped out. But anyway, hang on. No, sorry.
Oh, good. Yeah. So yeah, thanks for your presentation. If the attendees have any questions, if you could pop it in the question and answer or the chat, that would be fantastic. But I was really struck by this idea of looking in the will for the measure of value of his collection, and thinking about how he changed that over time and left particular requirements for that collection to be passed on.
Well, it's remarkable because he made his will at the beginning of January 1820, and in one or two sentences he disposed of vast estates in Lincolnshire and nearly 200 tenants, generating income of over £20,000 a year. And initially he left it. He left everything. He left the 32 Soho Square and all the contents to his wife. But he must have thought about this, because 2 weeks later, with the codicil, he made these other provisions where he left everything to Robert Brown, which was a rather remarkable thing to do. But that's another story.
Yeah, brilliant. Anna asks whether you have also looked at Banks's sister as a collector, Sarah Sophia Banks.
Yes, but she...
ephemera collection is in the British
Yeah, she didn't really
Museum
collect
still.
books. She collected medals and cards and all this sort of thing. And
Prints
she
and
died
drawings, says Anna. Prints and drawings.
Yeah, yes. She died in 2018. She preceded Banks. So the thing is, he had no sort of close family. He had no children, or no legitimate children. And once the sister died, he only had the wife, and her family, the Knatchbull Huginsons, they probably would have ended up with everything had he not changed his will by adding that codicil. And from what we know of how Sir Edward Knatchbull sort of disposed of Banks's papers, it's a good thing that he didn't leave everything to the wife, because the Knatchbulls really decimated Banks's collections, other than the books.
Gillian says that Banks's library was essential to Matthew Flinders' research, and Banks was very willing to share the books with him.
Yes. Well, one of the features of his library was that it was open to anybody who had a legitimate interest in the works. That was obviously a large number of members of the Royal Society and people like Flinders and Robert Brown, this sort of thing. So he was very generous in that respect. In fact, it was probably at the time the largest scientific library in the country, much more so than the British Museum, and that's why it was a mecca for people. In fact, I think it was every Sunday morning he would have a breakfast and invite people, and anybody would be free to come, and then they'd spend the rest of the day in the library.
Susan asked, can you describe Banks's regular rectangular book stamp in more detail?
Well, I've got an image of it.
Great.
Just hang on a sec. If I can find it. It's on the PowerPoint list.
Oh,
Here we are. Can you see that?
Yeah, maybe if you stop sharing, we'll be able to see it in a bigger detail. Yep, okay.
So if I close this, there we are. Now that's his book plate at the top, which is he probably commissioned even while he was at Oxford. And it's got the family coat of arms, but it's got that rather elaborate foliage around it, which is almost sort of slightly pretentious. But he stopped using that by 1768. And can you see the book stamp?
Yeah.
It's basically his signature. And that's what he used on all his books for the rest of his life.
Great.
And it says a lot about him, I think, as a person, that he abandoned this rather elaborate and pretentious book plate and just opted for this simple book stamp to signify his ownership of a book.
There's much interest in your talk, and there are many more questions, but I'm going to have to be a strict chair and move on to the next presentation and invite people to ask questions. Gillian had more, Thomas had more, to maybe email you about those.
Okay.
Send us
I'm sorry I couldn't work out how to do the PowerPoint, but I'll send it to you and maybe you can put it up on the site.